Running a small business means I wear lots of hats. When I put on my hiring hat, I can count on LinkedIn Hiring Pro to make it easy. LinkedIn Hiring Pro helps manage my hiring workflow, puts my job post in front of a unique network of professionals, and matches me with the best candidates for my business. I can also share my job with my network. No other job site lets me do that. No wonder most small businesses say they'd use LinkedIn Hiring Pro again. Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Hello and welcome to Fintech Insider Insights. I'm Benjamin Ensor, Director of Research and Strategy at 11FS. Today we're exploring one of the biggest, most emotional and most expensive financial journeys most people ever undertake, buying a home. Now we've been talking about fixing home buying for years. Property searches have moved online, mortgage applications have become digital, and buyers have access to more information than ever before. Yet, wherever you are in the world, the experience can often still feel broken. A few years ago, we published a report about home buying, and we identified 3 recurring themes: complexity, a lack of transparency, and poor orchestration. And so while the technology has continued to advance, many of those underlying challenges still remain. Buyers are still left acting as a project manager, chasing updates, and keeping the process moving between multiple providers. So today we're going to ask what's changed, what still isn't working, and where can technologies like AI and better collaboration across the ecosystem make a big difference. So to discuss this, I'm joined by 3 fabulous guests. First of all, I'd love to welcome Maria Harris, Chair of the Open Property Data Association and an advisor. Maria, welcome back to the show. Please can you remind listeners who've not come across you before a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh, lovely to be back, Benjamin. Thanks for having me back on. So yes, Maria Harris, founder and chair of the OPDA, which was a job that I fell into entirely by accident. And most people probably remember me from my work in mortgage lending. Been in mortgages for the last 20 years and was part of the team who built Atom Bank, which was the UK's first digital bank and the first digital mortgage.
Fabulous. Welcome back. I'm also delighted to welcome Daniel O'Connor, Chief Operating Officer of LendInvest. Welcome to the show, Daniel. Please, could you also tell our listeners a little bit about you and a little bit about LendInvest?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on, Benjamin. I've spent 20 years in financial services, predominantly in full-service banks in the UK and then latterly in fintech. As you said, I'm CEO at LendInvest. We're a listed UK property finance platform that aims to bring together specialist expertise and technology to make property finance simpler. We've lent over £9 billion on the platform since inception in 2008. And that's in what we today define in the market as specialist mortgages, but we might get into that later in the conversation today. So that's predominantly buy-to-let lending, residential, bridging and development finance. My job here is essentially making sure the operating platform runs effectively, so the technology, the processes and the people that enable us to lend to those that are looking to buy a home or remortgage, as well as supporting them through the life cycle. For the last few years, we've been working hard, as many have been, on making that journey simpler and faster where possible for customers and broker partners that we engage with. But looking forward to the conversation today and to some of the constraints that remain in the market and how that needs to continue to evolve at pace at an industry level.
Fabulous. Thank you for joining us. And I'm also delighted to welcome Lucy Wayment, co-founder of Welleness. Fantastic to have you joining us today, Lucy. Could you also tell our listeners a little bit about you and a little bit about Welleness?
Yes, of course. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So I'm Lucy. I'm one of the co-founders of Welleness. We are on a mission to make financial advice affordable and accessible for women for the first time. And we look at finances holistically. So that includes mortgage and home, as well as, protection, pensions, investing, legacy. And we're using AI to automate a lot of the compliance and admin that makes advice so expensive to deliver at the moment, so that we can make it more accessible to more women. Elle is our proprietary AI. She helps women understand their gaps with a financial score, and she can help them build confidence and then connect them with a female advisor when the time's right.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so let's dive in and let's start with why buying a home is still so painful in many parts of the world. As I said before, it's one of the biggest financial decisions most of us ever make. It's also one of the most emotional. And yet, despite years of digital innovation, many buyers still describe the process as confusing, stressful, financially overwhelming. When we asked you, our audience, to sum up the home buying journey in one word, your responses ranged from mind-boggling and expensive to builder-centric, migraine, soul-destroying, and even Ponzi. So what still isn't working? Daniel, let's maybe come to you first. We've seen a lot of development over the past couple of decades. We've seen fintech, addressing all sorts of problems, and yet home buying still feels quite difficult in many parts of the world. Why do you think it's still so hard?
It's quite the tee up, isn't it? And quite the indictment. I think actually, Maria, on the last time you were on the show, you were talking about how I think the survey was that the only worst experience in a journey was a bereavement journey, and then second behind that, buying a home. So certainly nothing to be proud of in that regard. I think ultimately it's no secret the system is incredibly fragmented end to end, and that's not a very easy thing that can be solved overnight. And Maria will definitely be best placed to talk about the work that's been done on how we try and remove some of that fragmentation that exists. But I mean, maybe if I frame, you touched on the 11FS home buying report previously, and if I frame it back in the same way. I mean, you touched on transparency. I do actually think that genuine progress has been made on transparency across the market. I think portals from a customer and from an intermediary point of view are a lot better, and I think that's reflective of wider digital evolution across all financial services, not just in home buying. And I think again that the work in the OPD are doing will continue to improve that. When we talk about the inherent complexity and the end-to-end journey, I think we've that has got better inside individual firms. I'm not sure I could say that it's got better between firms. I think we can see the path to that improving, but I'm not sure considerable progress has been made on that necessarily. And then the third point that you touched on was orchestration, and that's the bit that I think is maybe being a bit harsh, almost untouched in reality, and it is the bit that needs to make the biggest difference across the market. And that's why we still have things like timelines to complete being an average of 4 months and fall-through rates of 1 in 3, although I have seen different stats on that, but they're all higher than 1 in 3. So I think it's perhaps so broken that people in the industry can't agree on how broken it is, but it's at least 1 in 3, if not more, in terms of a fall through rate. So that is, I think, the honest assessment. That's maybe 1.5 out of the 3 in terms of progress that's been made. But we are describing here it's not a one customer opening one account with one firm. We're talking about here 6+ different parties all playing different roles in an inherently fragmented journey. So I don't think that's something that we are going to come back together in a few months' time and is going to be resolved. But I think as we'll get on to later in the conversation, there is certainly, I'm more positive, a lot more positive about what the outlook looks like and the opportunities that it presents. But we'll come to that next, I'm sure.
Fabulous. Maria, there's a clue in the name of the Open Property Data Association, but what do you see as some of the challenges and some of the ways we might go about fixing them?
And yes, and I completely agree. I mean, some of the words that people have used to describe are so emotional, as they should be. Buying a home is not only just an important and kind of life-changing moment, but it generally comes at the same time as you're doing something else that is life-changing and emotional. We tend to move house because we are moving for work, or we're moving out of our parents, or we've finished uni, or we're moving in with a partner, or we've broken up with a partner, or there's lots of kind of life events that drive usually moving a property. And so, yeah, it tends to be an emotional time and then an emotional process on top of an emotional time. So I'm not surprised that people describe it that way, but it is a horrendous endorsement for the industry that that's how people feel about it, and it's getting worse, not better. So fundamentally very broken. And yes, lots of very good reasons. That I'm sure none of it was deliberate. That's not happened by design. But what you do have are lots of industries who work on a transaction, and those industries are not designed to work together. They're very siloed. They have their own regulators. They have their own compliance, their own conduct risk, their own ways of working, their own culture, and their own ways of doing things that are not that don't align around the customer or the customer's experience. And it's really interesting when you do look at how it's done in different jurisdictions, where we have everything from home buying being a very legally binding upfront way of working in certain countries, where you can't make a mortgage offer, or you can't make an offer on a property without that being a binding contract, to the UK, where you have the exact opposite, and anybody can drop out at any moment in the transaction with no repercussions whatsoever, and that there's no consistent way of buying a house anywhere in the world. It's not consistent in countries, and it's not consistent across countries. And I think customers really feel the pain of that. It's an awful process, and one that desperately needs fixing.
So just as a quick side note to international listeners, the UK actually has arguably three different systems. So there's a legal system in England and Wales, which doesn't work particularly well. There's a legal system in Scotland that works better, and many Scots would argue works better all round. And there's also an auction system, which provides a third alternative. And the reason this matters is, in each of those systems, when the contract is binding, happens at a different point, and that obviously feeds into the experience. So I just want to clarify that. Lucy, what's your view on the pain of buying a mortgage, and the progress we have or haven't made in terms of making it better?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can echo a lot of what's already been said, but I think, there has been positive steps made forward. I think, things like digital ID checks have really been a game changer. My co-founder literally had to go to a solicitor's office this week in person to validate her passport, which just feels, crazy, doesn't it, in this day and age? And I think, there's new things that are in place that are making a big difference, but they're not consistent across all these different touch points, has been mentioned. I think, the conveyancing process itself, particularly in the UK, is where it's so fragmented, and there's just so many dependencies on these different parties. And, I think a lot of that emotive response comes from the uncertainty that's such a big part of the home buying process, in England at least, where you just never know if it's going to fall through. You feel so unable to get a quick answer. Yes, there are digital journeys now that sit alongside the kind of manual process, but I think they haven't completely replaced it. They're sort of sitting as a layer on top, and there's still a lot of gaps where there's still so much uncertainty. So I think there has been progress. I think this felt like quite a depressing beginning. I do think that there has been progress, but I think, like Daniel said, it's so many touch points to look at. It's quite fragmented. There's lots of different regulations, as you mentioned, Maria. So it's not something that can be fixed with one great streamlined journey. We've got to find a way to, connect all these different sources. So still a lot of way to go.
Daniel, I always think sometimes one of the challenges here is that people are looking for sort of technology solutions to what's essentially a legal problem. I mean, one of the reasons it's so bad in England and Wales is that those those offers you make, as sort of Maria was talking about earlier, are not binding until right at the end of the process. Scotland's process is much better. The auction process is better because it's binding much earlier. But it's also that point you were making, Daniel, about the sort of orchestration and the sheer number of parties involved. So is part of the issue here that this isn't really a technology problem per se. It's a sort of legal problem. It's an orchestration problem, and also maybe to the point sort of Lucy was sort of starting to drive out that actually nobody's really got the buyer's interests in mind. everybody's got their own piece of the pie and their own piece of the puzzle they're trying to worry about, but nobody's sort of looking at the whole picture for the customer.
Yeah, I think Maria touched on it earlier. Everybody is seeing it as a transaction, and nobody is seeing it as helping the customer buy a home, which is ultimately what they're looking for. And just for the record, I think Scots law, you're right, it's better in some ways. I think there are lots of other anomalies and ways that make, I think, Scots law challenge in its own right. And I think the offers over system in Scotland brings its own challenges as well. But you're right, I think having those different dynamics in the UK alone, that actually just brings unnecessary complexity in its own right to have to navigate. I think technology, I think your point's right. Is it a technology challenge? I think technology can absolutely help us solve this. I mean, I often think, sadly, in technology terms, I think of the customer as being the integration layer. Effectively, the customer is the only common denominator that exists at all points throughout the whole transaction, and that's a big part of the problem, is that no one is seeing it all, and many parts of that journey aren't connected, or as Maria is going to solve for us all, is the lack of consistency, even in terminology or definitions of data points that are used. So even when you do connect them together, they don't automatically join, and so you're unlikely to get to that outcome. So I think the standards before then, technology can become a solution, but I think it is a lot of it is ways of working, like you describe. I mean, I often, within our own organisation or the ones that I've worked in, you sort of get that same in large banks or large organisations, that same sort of silo-based thinking, and you'll get parts of the business that are sort of high-fiving that they are providing great service within their own functional boundaries, but actually when you look at that horizontally, there is nothing to be high-fived about in terms of the actual customer outcomes or the overall service provision. And so I think that's true within organisations, but I think when you zoom out from that and you look at it as a home buying experience end to end, I think it's the same analogy that can be applied to that. Everyone is doing what they can to sort of automate and make things simpler within their own boundaries, but in reality we've continued to make to speed up the fastest part of what is ultimately a slow process overall end to end.
Maria, what do you think of that? Do you think we can make progress on that sort of orchestration? Can the industry as a whole, or the different components of the industry as a whole, sort of start reducing some of that pain for customers, start becoming better integrated?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Daniel's absolutely right. Technology is not the problem. The technology to solve this exists. The behaviour change and the hearts and minds change to redesign a process around a consumer experience doesn't exist. But there are some other challenges, and some of those challenges are very fundamental. And this one is fairly unique to the UK. So the UK has a data challenge in that our property data is not digitised at source. It's not available to the consumer. The consumer can't easily access their data, and they can't easily share their data. Lucy's example of digital ID and still having to go into a solicitor's office with a physical copy of your passport to go, yes, this is me, looking at this face matches, as if, the passport office has a border control person in every lawyer's office who can validate that that's the right decision. That kind of infrastructure and lack of data is a real challenge, but also we don't have trust mechanisms in the UK for sharing this data. So even if the consumer could access their own land registry record, they have no way of sharing it and proving that it came from land registry and that it can be trusted by all of the other parties in the chain. And that's one of the things that we need to solve to make this better. And other countries have done this. There's some really great examples of places like Norway, where their land registry worked with their mortgage lender community and they invested in digitising the land registry and made it free and open source to everyone. Complete game changer, absolute game changer. We're seeing it happen in the UAE, where they're using distributed ledger and they are tokenizing property records and making it really easy to safely, securely share your ID and your data and your property relationship all in one way through a wallet, and to be able to share that then with a mortgage lender or a real estate agent or the conveyancing process. So there are great examples around the world of technology already being in place to fix this. Part of our challenge, though, is we needed political will to get this done, and that political backing has been delivered. We have primary legislation that was delivered to make this happen, and that legislation was delivered in June 2025. And now we have a Ministry of Housing roadmap that says we are going to transform this programme. We are going to make home buying better and digitised. And they have set out some very clear objectives in terms of mandating digital property packs, property logbooks, making this data available in a really good structured format, and putting the trust framework mechanism in place to make that happen, much as we did for open banking. And open banking's been live for such a long time and is now doing millions and millions of transactions. So yeah, definitely not a tech problem, but some core infrastructure challenges that we have the ability to fix.
Lucy, I'd love to bring you in on this orchestration issue, because if you're selling a home, you have an estate agent, a realtor, a real estate agent, call it what you will in different countries, but you have someone who's working for you, at least in theory, to sell your house. But if you're buying a house, well, the estate agent might be trying to offload certain properties in their portfolio to you, but they're not really working for you. And there's not really anybody who's on your side. I mean, your solicitor, your lawyer works for you, but they're only doing a part of your business. I mean, who could or should maybe orchestrate that customer journey? Is the problem that there just isn't a business opportunity there?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think that really hits the nail on the head as to how you feel as a consumer. You feel like there's no one that's got your pure best interests at heart, and especially when there's different people within a chain, and there's added complications of everyone having slightly different desired outcomes of how the situation's going to play out. So I think that is how you feel. You feel incredibly frustrated that there's not one touch point where you can actually speak to someone and get an answer. Often, especially with solicitors, it's not that easy to just, contact them directly, or, like you say, your estate agent's working for different people. In terms of who could own that kind of end to end, I do think, technology and AI is enabling us to plug kind of knowledge gaps. And I think one of the issues around why home buying feels kind of really complex for lots of people is there's so much that they don't understand, and they don't, realise there's a real lot of jargon that still exists. There's lots of costs that people aren't aware of up front. So I think, some of it comes from what feels so stressful is when you don't fully understand what's happening or why and what that means for you practically. So I think if we could find a way to wrap, and that's kind of how we're building Welleness, is we see AI guidance as a kind of top layer to help, bridge this financial literacy gap, be it mortgages or be it, a whole other range of things within your financial literacy. But then we still see a human in the loop, because I think you still need that person that you can speak to and that can know the nuances of the situation. And but yeah, so I think, perhaps the way that we're moving, we can use the technology progression, use AI as a kind of guidance layer to fill some of these unknowns and these gaps of how the process actually looks and works. But we still need someone, I think, that's a touch point who really is the consumer champion in that process. And we see that it could be a financial advisor. I think lots of people don't think of going to a financial advisor for a mortgage. They will go specific to a mortgage broker. But what a financial advisor has that a mortgage broker doesn't have is that bigger picture of what else is going on in your life and those other elements that might contribute to how your mortgage application plays out. So I think, someone who can get visibility across that whole journey and be available would be a great person to own this process. How practical that is, I'm not sure, but that's the kind of ideal, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to agree on the consumer having control and understanding and having a safe place to go and to ask questions. And mortgage intermediaries do a great job of managing all of that for consumers today, which is why we see such a huge proportion of the market comes through the intermediary channel. But the technology will help them too. And because when we've got this right, we'll actually free up their time to be able to have those very human conversations about dreams, aspirations, challenges, what's stressing people out, and to help take some of that away. So there's absolutely a human element to this, but the technology will unlock quite a lot of it.
Daniel, just briefly, I was just going to follow up with you on sort of Lucy's question about, is this practical? I mean, from what Lucy's saying, it's potentially a sort of missed opportunity by some of the sort of mortgage brokers, financial advisors and other intermediaries to sort of step up into that role of customer advisor. And I'm not suggesting it's easy to do that. Is there an opportunity there, or is the home buying advisor of the future Claude or Gemini or indeed Welleness is L?
No, I mean, the way that I see it is, and I know this might be counterintuitive to a lot of the rhetoric, but I think AI can be the enabler of human empathy, not the bit that takes it all away. And that, as you're implying, a broker doesn't need to spend all the time worrying about what the next form is that need to be filled in, or comparing between lenders and engaging with different development managers across different lenders, but can actually focus on the needs of the customer there and predicting what their next needs might be. And I think, I've seen some stats recently that people are turning to Claude and ChatGPT and others already for advice, and I don't think, with all the various warnings around that, I think if people have got their eyes wide open, I think for a lot of people with perhaps straightforward circumstances, that isn't necessarily a bad idea. But I think this is an opportunity, as I see it. I think the mortgage broker is the closest to the customer to be able to step into that, and it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to also see which lenders might want to start to use this as an opportunity, especially, again, back to the work that's going to set data standards and try and drive up improved interoperability between different players, whether actually lenders, etc., see that as an opportunity to step into the front end. I think some might find that attractive, some might not, but I think mortgage brokers are well placed today to utilise the technology to spend less time on the administrative side of the role today, and with the time that frees up, spend more of that time stepping into perhaps being that concierge or that guidance for a customer through a full transaction, but armed with capability that would allow them to join up the different parts of the experience, because the technology is underpinning that. After we've got all the frameworks and everything that are delivered on that, obviously there's still a lot to do on all of that, but that's I think why I'm quite optimistic that you can start to see the different pieces coming together here, from data standards to the rails in terms of APIs and even potentially blockchain playing a part in that, and then with the overlay of AI, you can start to see how you could start to create some 21st century experiences in the home buying journey.
Thank you. Let's take a quick break here and we will be back very shortly.
Running a small business means I wear lots of hats. When I put on my hiring hat, I can count on LinkedIn Hiring Pro to make it easy. LinkedIn Hiring Pro helps manage my hiring workflow, puts my job post in front of a unique network of professionals, and matches me with the best candidates for my business. I can also share my job with my network. No other job site lets me do that. No wonder most small businesses say they'd use LinkedIn Hiring Pro again. Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? or white chocolate mocha. Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
So before the break, we explored why home buying is still so fragmented. And of course, home buying is really a journey. It's a journey to home ownership, from understanding when you're ready to buy, through financing and completion, to settling in, maintaining your home, and eventually refinancing or moving again, often at a time of emotional stress, as Maria pointed out earlier. So what could and should the future of home buying and home ownership look like? Lucy, I mean, building on what Daniel was just sort of saying about the sort of need for a concierge, sometimes it seems like there's a missing product, because you've got lots of lenders offering mortgages and you've got solicitors obviously offering conveyancing and so on, but there sort of isn't a product that actually helps the customer sort of buy and manage the home. What are some of the sort of underserved needs that customers have, and how do we see that potentially getting solved with the kind of 21st century solution that Daniel was starting to talk about?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, even researching for the show, I was sort of definitely getting some ideas of things that we might want to implement at some point, because I think one of the things that's really striking about mortgages is they're probably going to be our biggest, financial purchase that we ever make. And yet we kind of treat them as inevitable. We take them out and then they run in the background. We don't really think about them again. And I think, again, that's a real maybe historic rhetoric around, like, you earn a certain amount of money, then you buy a home and you get a mortgage. But that leaves so much that we don't understand around, is that the best place to put your money? Is this the best place to have all of your money? Maybe you do get a mortgage and you leave some elsewhere. What does it mean to actually be able to afford your mortgage? Like, what are the things that you're going to need in place? And then what are these extra costs that might crop up that we're not necessarily consciously aware of? So I think some kind of, tool that really lets you see the money that you've got in your mortgage and look at how that's playing out over time, but also, what might have got you there in the first place. I think there's such a gap between thinking about, is this the right time for me to buy a house? What do I need to get in place? And especially if you're not, it's not a straightforward mortgage, as I think we touched on a bit, for people that are self-employed, this is really tricky. And for people who are first-time buyers who maybe don't have the full picture, there's lots of things they don't prepare for. So kind of from that first touch point of thinking about, like, what do I need in place? What, how much money do I need? And, all these extra costs that I need to consider. Then where does my money actually go, and what does it look like over time once the mortgage is completed? I think there's a real missing piece around this kind of, like, long-term ownership of your home and what your money looks like tied up in it. And I think there's, another point around that is that a lot of the women that we speak to will say, because we look at investing as well, investing's not for me. And it's like, well, do you have a mortgage? Because you're in the market, you are investing, but you might not be thinking of it as a kind of conscious investment. So I think, again, there's a education piece just around, like, whether this is the right move for you. Once you've made it, how do you maximize it? How do you keep checking in on it? And how do you get visibility of it in a way that's maybe not super clear at the moment?
Interesting. Really interesting. Maria, what do you think on this? Do you think there are sort of missing capabilities? And Lucy's making a really interesting point as well about groups of people who find it particularly difficult to get mortgages. I mean, which is basically all young people these days, given rising property prices in so many countries. But also, specific groups like self-employed and so on. And then the wider point about sort of some women lacking confidence and so on. I've realised I've just thrown a ton of problems at you, Maria, but what are your thoughts on how we might go about creating better solutions for people?
Yeah, and all of the things that you've said are absolutely true, and there's lots of evidence that says that's that impacts everybody everywhere. And there's also a huge awareness gap about people think they will never get onto the property market. We still talk about it as being a ladder, as if it's something that you aspire to go up, which is not the case everywhere. Lots of other places you buy property with your family or with your friends, and it's much more of a kind of a community type purchase, like where it's not all on you to buy it individually. So some very idiosyncratic things that happen in different places. But is there a gap? Absolutely. Some of it comes back to the infrastructure and the lack of, especially where property data is not readily available. But also, even though open banking's been around for quite a long time, open finance is still quite early in terms of adoption. So you look at places like Brazil, who've launched their open finance products, and that's absolutely great. The trust framework's all in place, all fully live, but there aren't many of those around yet. And in order to pull together or to create an industry where you would get really good customer experience propositions and prepared to invest and build solutions for consumers, they need access to data, and they need to be able to connect the consumer to the different things that they need to know. So you need access to your finance data, your savings, to be able to pull in your earnings potential and what you're spending, your spending patterns, and for that to be able to use your data to give you insights and information and nudges and tell you the things that you need to do to get ready to buy a property, or to tell you that actually you can, because lots of people think they can't. And actually, if somebody had reviewed their finances, they would tell them, no, you can afford a property today. It might change your expectations about when and what you can afford, but we need tools that can do that. So as that data starts becoming more accessible, I think we'll see what happened in open banking, where open banking was created for a very specific purpose, to make it easier for people to switch banks. And that's not what happened at all. What we saw was a whole fintech industry that blossomed and created amazing customer experience platforms, and those don't exist for property yet. So we've got some kind of early emerging contenders. We've got people who are building like really good wallet solutions, good customer concierge platforms, but they need the data and they need the connectivity for things to work the way that you'd want to for the consumer. And the UK is starting that process through the Smart Property Data Programme, but also through the transition of open banking to open finance and starting to open up things like mortgage data. So they will come. I think there's a huge opportunity for a whole customer tech industry to provide some really, really beautiful solutions.
It really takes you in an opportunity at proper personalisation, doesn't it? I think fundamentally we have a mortgage market that is designed to go out of its way to categorise customers into buckets that then drives what products and what pricing in many cases is then given to them. And I touched on earlier in the intro what we play in what we today define as the specialist end of the market, and everybody might have slightly varied the definitions of what that is today, but they would all have in common this sort of notion of there's some level of complexity, whether it's to do with the customer's income or the property type, or there's some level of complexity that dictates that that's a specialist mortgage, and therefore assuming that doesn't fit into mainstream. And then we have another sector of lenders that sort of go out their way to do that. I think to provide those loans. I think what's really interesting is if AI and the technology developments we've been describing ultimately cuts through that complexity, what is specialist tomorrow? Does that keep reinventing itself at the top end of the market and become or does it get bigger? Does it become more mainstream? It's interesting in the sense of the conversation we just had there. How does that play through into product innovation? Because I think if we're really honest, mortgage products hasn't had a great deal of innovation for a hell of a long time in the UK. There are sort of variations, but they tend not to stray from the 2 and the 5 year fix. And we in the UK particularly, clearly elsewhere there are perhaps better variations that we may need to start to explore. But it's just interesting whether that definition changes the shape of the sector, which then changes the product offerings that customers have, and often the pricing as well.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because Maria, you're sort of saying, well, the key unlocks here, the keys that will unlock things here are really, to some extent, government, right? It's government's changing legal processes to make their sort of binding earlier, to sort of simplify the legal contracting process that makes home buying better. But it's also government enabling more data sharing and enabling digital records to smoothen out that whole process. And you've given us some nice examples of Norway and Brazil and certain governments that are trying to do that. And then, Daniel, you're then saying, well, actually, once governments start doing that and you start getting a better legal infrastructure, better legal guardrails and a better data infrastructure, that then unlocks much more opportunity for personalization, because you're right, the mortgage product today, is pretty fixed, it's pretty standard. And yet, almost to the point you were making earlier, Lucy, where actually, of course, our lives, what we need evolves through our lives. The idea that you buy one house and you live in that house for 30 years or 50 years or whatever is just not the reality for the vast majority of people. So what actually people need is sort of flexible long-term lending that morphs and flexes with their family situation. So it seems like the government unlock is the first, there's a series of government unlocks that then enable industry to potentially then start sort of innovating and radicalizing the product. Or can that happen first? Can we start creating better lending products, better home ownership products without those government unlocks? Big question for you, Lucy.
Okay. Oh, I don't know the answer to that as to whether we can create them. I mean, I guess to a degree we can. I think I really agree with Daniel's point around, with greater personalization comes greater accessibility, which I just think is so key to, also improving how people describe the home buying experience and the journey. Because I think, we touched on it right at the beginning, but this uncertainty, this lack of visibility, this inaccessibility is what makes it feel very difficult for lots of people. And I think that is because of this bucketing. It's because of these very strict criteria around, levels of income. And we need some of that because, I don't think we got to it, but in my notes, I'd had something on just, how costs have just ramped up so significantly. And if people aren't prepared for that, then that's a real challenge as well, and something that people need, better understanding of and better ways to model how their finances are actually going to look once they're locked into a mortgage and a home. But I think, if we can use AI to better and open finance to better understand more quickly what people's actual lives look like versus a criteria that was set in place a long time ago and probably hasn't moved on a lot, then there is the opportunity to create products that tailor to those people and that offer a much better solution if you're not in a sort of straight box of what a normal mortgage might look like. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, but I guess there's the regulatory piece and the legal, I think there does have to be some element of it running side by side.
But you're making such an interesting point, because I think in other areas, in other parts of credit and in insurance, we've seen a lot of new entrants coming in and taking advantage of new data, better data, alternative sources of data to create new products, to serve other parts of the market and to serve people who, frankly, don't fit into that sort of standard nuclear family with a, job they've had for 20 years or whatever, which just isn't the reality for... And so actually what you're saying is there's an enormous opportunity here to create much more personalized sort of longer term lines of credit and funding and so on that could upend the industry once we can just sort of get a bit more of the open data that, Maria, you've been pushing for and advocating for a decade or so.
Yes, and so there is a regulatory piece. There's a governance and government piece as well about making the legal structure right. But there's also how mortgages are funded. And I'm sure Daniel's probably much better at speaking to this than I am. But the reason that there haven't you haven't seen huge amounts of mortgage innovation is because we are so constrained by how we actually get mortgage funding, how we do hedging, how we do swap rates, how we measure it out in 25 and 30-year chunks, and how you put those into blocks that then mean you must do it in sub 60% LTV because that carries a risk weighting. So I would love to see all of those three things come together and actually free up some different ways of thinking about how mortgages are funded, or to look at some of the international examples and say, is there a better way to do this that would help more first-time buyers or more people who have different circumstances, who are actually the majority of the market. The majority of us don't fit into this perfect, ideal 2.4 kids and, a Volvo on the drive. Most of us don't fit that market. So I think Dan's point's absolutely right. Specialist isn't really specialist. Specialist is the majority of people. That's not specialist, that's everyday life. And what we probably need to think about is, how do we fund mortgages and how do we unlock the things that you need to get risk comfortable, that we can start lending to different people in different ways? And how do you use your personalisation data to make it? How do you build a mortgage that is a Maria mortgage or a Lucy mortgage or a Benjamin mortgage rather than a bank mortgage?
There's a big trust piece, isn't there? And that's where, Benjamin, to your challenge of can you run ahead of the work? And I think that the truth is there's been many attempts at that, hasn't there, in the past? And we're, as an industry, we have to collaborate to make sure that this time is different. And I'm positive that that's the case. But I think the framework will help cover two angles to trust that I think are important. Clearly, customer consent is one of them. We're talking about sharing their data up and down across many players as part of this journey, and there needs to be sort of clarity and transparency around that, and that's obviously a key enabler to many of the improved experiences that we're describing here. The other is a bit more boring, maybe, is liability, and I think there's still probably quite a lot. Ken, Maria, you'd be better to talk to it than me, but I think there are probably a number of players here. I mean, a lot of why you find the five of the same checks being undertaken by different players across the end-to-end journey today is a defence mechanism. It's that liability isn't necessarily clear. So I think when we get into this world, that's a big conversation clearly to have, is if we're sharing this same data in consistent ways, that's great, but what happens when it's wrong? Who's going to be liable for that? So there's obviously a lot of big hurdles to overcome, but they are surmountable. We have to find a way through them. But I think big questions that I think you can only do justice to in a proper program like this being described to work through. I think running ahead of that risks industrializing noise, in my opinion, before the frameworks and processes are agreed. It's a convoluted industry that we need to bring together in a consistent fashion. And I think that means we need to do it in a structured way, in my view.
Really, really, really interesting. And I also love that point you were making, Maria, about thinking about banks' sort of capital adequacy ratios and what they can and can't lend, and that actually, capital has a cost. That banks obviously not only need to think about getting that capital back, but also think about, their overall books and the amount of risk they're taking on and what kind of risks they're taking on and so on. Okay, well, we're getting towards the end of the show, so maybe one last sort of question to you all. Do you think the competitive advantage shifts here? Do you think there's a world in which offering the best home buying experience becomes a competitive advantage, and that maybe whoever can master that sort of blend of human advice and AI reassurance and education or whatever, that creates some opportunity for firms? Does competitive advantage shift? Lucy, what do you think? Is there a window here where somebody or firms figure out how to blend human advice, AI, and just give buyers a better journey and gain an advantage from that? What do you think?
I absolutely think so. I mean, I think I touched on it earlier, but around the kind of financial literacy. But I think, lots of times in financial services, there's a kind of either an education piece to be done or a convincing piece that you need this product, you need this service. I think, home buying, 45% of homeowners in the UK have a mortgage. So if you can make that process, if you can put the customer first and give them a great experience, I genuinely think you've got the foundation for a much broader long-term customer relationship. And, it's the kind of, not easiest way in, but it's certainly a way in that feels very normal to people and very typical. So I think you're capturing people with something that they're probably going to do. And if you can make that great, then you can talk about all these other elements of, their financial life that you maybe can help with. So, I think absolutely. And I totally agree with Daniel that trust is going to be the key piece here. Even aside, all the amazing stuff we've talked about in terms of how, better data sharing, better tech can help change this process. I think, like most things in financial services, like trust is the absolute core piece to it all. And if you think back to those emotive words at the beginning, they're about emotion. And I think it's how they felt going through this process has made them feel really negative. And if you can, even if you can't fix all of these fragmented pieces just yet, if you can provide the customer with a feeling that they've got a, champion on their side who's going to concierge some of these fragmented bits in the meantime, I think that's a great, in between step until we move on even further with what, technology can unlock. So, I think it's a huge opportunity.
Maria, what do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, we do our annual consumer survey, and 86% of people who filled in our survey, and it was more than 5,000 respondents, want this process to be better and were supportive of having mechanisms where they could safely and securely share their data. They want to use digital property packs. They want to be able to have their digital identity and their checks done once and a way to safely and securely share them. But they need solution providers who can do that. Right now they have the will is there, the consumer demand is there, but right now you have very little choice over who is transacting for you, how they work with each other. Like, you have no control over your own transaction, over your own home buying process. And once you've done it, the transaction forgets that it ever happened. And then every time you want to do anything with your property data, you start again. And you rinse and repeat it every single time. And that has to stop. So I think we'll see some good solutions to solve the home buying process and do all of the concierge, the interoperability, all of the integration across the horizontal players. But I think you're also going to start seeing some really nice life cycle solutions as things like property logbooks, property wallets become more prevalent and start being able to pull in other sources of data. You'll see lots of nice customer experiences on the back of that. And the customer demand is there, absolutely there.
And Daniel, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything that's been said. I think in recent years we've had that mindset shift gradually. I'll take a lender perspective. I think there was a point in time, I guess, where we complete on a loan today, customer moves in, and we'll maybe speak to them again in 5 years' time or 6 months from the end of the sort of maturity of that of that loan. That can, in some cases, if everything's gone okay, be conceivably the next touch point. I think the industry has recognised that your customer retention strategy can't just start 6 months from the end of a fixed term of that, and really you need to be deepening those relationships on an ongoing basis. And I think seeing it not as the transaction and actually seeing this as an opportunity to build those much deeper relationships is it is important. It makes complete business sense from a lender point of view. So I think those that can blend the digital speed with the human understanding, using data and technology, not to distance themselves from customers, but actually to get closer. More doesn't mean faster tech. It can mean more human empathy at the right moment to deepen that relationship. And as I said earlier, I see AI as being an enabler of that empathy ultimately. I guess my last thought, and there's definitely one for another podcast another time, is there is another reason beyond the processes and technology and that has held the industry back, and I think organisations need to get into the right mindsets and organise themselves within their organisations to be able to capitalise on the technology opportunities that we've had. And we won't go deep into digital transformation and those that weren't able to capitalise on that opportunity. But I think this is the next evolution of that. And I think many organisations have got a lot of ground to make up, I think, in terms of how to get themselves best placed to be able to make the most of this and ultimately provide stronger customer outcomes.
No question. All right. Well, that wraps up our discussion today. The three of you have been absolutely fantastic. I've loved this conversation and I've learned a ton from all three of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can our listeners find out a little bit more about you and your companies? Lucy, where can people find out more about you and Welleness?
You can come to our website, which is wellness.ai, or you can obviously find me on LinkedIn as well, which is just Lucy Wayment.
And Maria, where can people find out more about you and the Open Property Data Association?
Yeah, on our website, openpropdata.org.uk, or please follow us on LinkedIn, Open Property Data Association, and anybody who connects with me on LinkedIn, you will find my contact details and my contact us.
And Daniel, where can people find out more about you and LendInvest?
LendInvest.com, and you can find more about us and me on LinkedIn.
And you can also find me, Benjamin Ensor, on LinkedIn, and you can find more about 11FS at 11FS.com. Thank you all so much for listening. If you've liked what you've heard, please do follow the podcast. Please do recommend us to your colleagues and friends. And if you want to join the conversation, just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to my three guests, and goodbye.
I see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney+. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet.
Go, 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 go!
A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney+.
It will be an adventure for the whole family.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.